Hello, everyone. So I am Nick Brandt, the product designer on the global search team. During my last showcase, I covered some research that we conducted on the global search team to better understand some of the needs of our users when it comes to code search. Today, I'll be covering one of the problems or insights we identified during that research in our path towards releasing a solution into our product. So the problem that we identified was that while searching for code, users often needed more details regarding when the portion of code that they searched for was last modified, which often required them to dig deep into the results that were presented to them. If they needed to do this with multiple results, this exacerbated the problem, requiring a lot of deep drilling and then back navigation. Some of the information that they were looking for were things like when the code was introduced, like the date or time, what MR added or modified this code to get additional context, as well as like who authored the code. So they have a reference or someone to talk about regarding it. There were different rationales for needing this information, with some of them being to investigate a bug or regression, or simply to gain a better understanding of some code changes that had been made. So how are users currently getting this information? As I mentioned before, users were having to navigate multiple levels in order to obtain this information. To make it even worse, once they were on these pages that did have the information, it often required them to also search again or scroll within the page to find a specific code that they had already originally searched for. So looking at these flows here on the screen, you can see that oftentimes a user would click on a result to go to the file detail page or the code view. And from there, they would typically take one of two different paths. One being navigate to the history page, where they can then look through the commits to find the one that was associated with the code that they had searched for. And from there, once they found the commit, they could go to that commit page and also navigate from there to the MR to get some additional context. The other option would be that they could navigate to the blame page, and from there they could find or scroll to the portion of code that they had originally searched for, and they can gain some of that information that I was talking about, such as the who, when, and the what. And from there, if they wanted, they could also navigate to the commit page and go further to the MR as well. Now, users may not always need to navigate all the way to the MR page as shown here, but even if they're just drilling down to, let's say, the commit or the history or blame page, this still requires a minimum of 2 levels plus in-page searching. If they choose to find the information through the history page, this will also require them to either know some of the details up front, such as like the commit, the author, or the date, or rely on some well-written commit messages to know if the portion that they were concerned with was changed in that specific commit, which not always happens or is possible. Or they may have to go through a process of exploration by drilling in and out of specific commits until they find where the change was made. So you can see how this can easily become frustrating for users to find this information. So I may have lost some of you when I referenced the blame page. So let me go over that a bit for those of you who don't have a good understanding of what that is. So the Git Blame is essentially built into Git. It provides details into the who, when, and the why code was last modified in a line-by-line basis. And for this reason, it's extremely useful in better understanding the details around when a specific portion of code was last changed. Lastly, although developers are often familiar with Git Blame, they aren't always aware that we offer an interface in our product for it. And when it comes to non-technical users, they're often unfamiliar that what the Git Blame is and that what it provides, and increasing exposure to this can drive value for them as well. And I myself can honestly say that I wasn't familiar with the Git Blame prior to last year, and I've already found many uses for it just in my day-to-day work. So I've also included a screenshot on this page to where the Git Blame link is located within the file detail page or the code view page within the header, and an example of what the blame page can look like. below that. So on the left-hand side of that page, you can see where we have the commit message along with the author and the date associated with the different lines. And then clicking on the actual commit would actually go to that commit detail page as well. One other thing to note is there's an icon also within that information that will also take you to the previous blame for that line item. Okay, so now that you're a bit more familiar with what the Git blame is, let's get back to the problem and how we work to solve for it. So when thinking how best to solve for this problem, we considered various approaches to elevate this valuable information for users. And some of these options were to, one, include this information directly in the results. Two, provide the ability to toggle on these additional details. And three, to link to the blame anchored to the specific line that they were interested in. So let's take a moment to review some of these options. So option one, include some of this information directly in the results. So the first and biggest thing to note with this approach is the caveat that users needed to understand when this portion of code that matched their query was last modified and not just the file itself. So this means that we can't simply provide metadata related to the file itself, but instead it needs to be based on each line of the code blob, because each line could essentially have a different commit, author, date, MR associated with it. And this leads to the second drawback on the list, being that it would add a lot of clutter to this page if we were to include it by default, which would affect scannability and readability of results, making it much harder to digest this page. And the last con mentioned here is more related to performance and development effort. Because this information isn't currently stored in Elasticsearch, which is essentially what we use to index the information that's provided in our results, it would require a separate query to actually obtain this information to display. This would also require some additional back-end and front-end considerations to account for this approach related to how we display this information. And also, with running a separate query for this information for the blame, we would also have to do this after the Elasticsearch had returned results, or essentially after the page load, which could present some additional challenges as well. So let's move on to option two, provide the ability to toggle on these additional details. So instead of having all of this details or information visible by default, we could offer the functionality to toggle this on or off, either at the result level or even at the page level. So in this example on this page, there's a button when hovering over results to toggle this information on. So example would be using that button to toggle these on and off. So this approach alleviates some of the concerns of the last option, such as the clutter concern, though it still has the downside of requiring that separate query for the information. Though there's definitely ways to solve for that problem. The other con to this approach is that the development effort is still not minimal, requiring non-trivial work for both the back end and front end, which is also related to the concern that I mentioned in option one. This takes us to the last option that I mentioned, option three, link to the blame anchored to the line. So in this example on this page, there's a link for each result which links to the blame page that we discussed earlier, but anchored to the first line within that result. So this helps the user to get to that information quicker and reduces the need for them to search or scroll once they get to the page. The downside to having this link at the result level versus like the line level is not as contextual. And in the future, if we start to reveal more matches in results, therefore having longer lines in results, this could still cause users to have to do some scrolling to locate the portion that they care most about once they got to the blame page. Here's a different example for this approach which aligns with the pattern of contextual actions that we use elsewhere in our product with code, and that's for diffs. So if you're familiar with things like the changes tab in MRs, when hovering over lines of diff code, the corresponding line number in that row is highlighted, along with an action that is presented to the user, in this case, commenting. So this example follows that pattern by displaying a blame link to the left of the line numbers when hovering over specific lines in the code results, as you can see here on the screen. This is more contextual than the first example, while also continuing to not be overly invasive to the user. The primary con to both these examples for option 3 is the user is still required to navigate away from the results page to get this information, though the experience is still much improved from the current experience. So which direction did we go and why? So we wanted to provide a balance between providing the most value to users while still keeping the initial effort minimal to get this out. With this in mind, we went with the last example that I showed in option 3 based on these main reasons. So for one, we wanted to leverage something that already existed in our product, which is the blame page. And so our first iteration of this, we wanted to focus on getting users to this information quicker without really recreating the wheel. So leveraging the blame page was the best way for us to do that. The second thing is we wanted minimal development effort to release. So this was something that we would be able to complete within a milestone, given our resources. With our backend team really focused on performance at the time, our front-end engineer was able to knock this out by themselves. Another reason with this approach was I wanted to align with other contextual blob actions that we have in our product, and that's diffs, for example. So I'm always in favor of reusing patterns that we use elsewhere in our product, as this helps us maintain a cohesive experience as we continue to build out our pattern library. And last on here, I wanted to make sure that we were not being invasive to users. So by not exposing all these details by default or being intrusive with other actions such as like popovers with links, we are keeping the interface clean and focused while still providing this improvement for users. So here we can see it in action. I'll kind of go over it here once it goes back to the beginning. So here we're on a results page, and you can see as I'm hovering over specific lines, it's highlighted with a little icon here on the left for viewing the blame. That takes you directly to the blame page, anchored to the spot that you cared about. And from here, you can see the date, the author, as well as the commit message associated with that specific line. From there, you can click on the commit to go to the commit detail. And then if you're also interested, you can then go to the MR to get that additional context. So you can see how it was a very minimal change here, but it made it a lot quicker to get to some of this information that the user cared about. So you're probably thinking at this point, so you just added a link. And yeah, pretty much. Granted, there was a bit more that went into it, but this work also set the stage for some of these things. So we're able to start tracking interest in the use of this feature and whether there may be value in further elevating some of this information. This could end up being similar to what was shown in option 2, where we add the capability to toggle this information for results, either inline or possibly within a drawer or some other method. Additionally, this feature can be applied to other areas of our product where it can also add value, such as the file detail page. It's a relatively straightforward change that can end up saving users time from searching or scrolling on the blame page. There's already an issue open for this, actually. Thank you, Pedro, for doing that. He beat me to it. And it is currently slated for 14.10 by the code source group. And last on here, it allowed us to continue to collaborate on future improvements to both this solution, as well as potentially rethinking how things like the Git Blame is built today in our product. So one thing that I have personally wondered about is that there's a way we can combine the file detail view or the code view with the Git Blame page for that view that we have today. Because when you look at them, you'll notice that very much of the page is staying the same with just an additional sidebar area for the Git Blame page. So if we could move towards this being more of a toggle on the page, this would also help to solve some of that searching or scrolling issues that I mentioned previously. There were also a couple bonuses that were included with this feature addition. So since we are now showing actions in the line numbers area of code results on hovering over any portion of the line, it made sense for us to change the current behavior for how the line link icon was being displayed. So this is essentially the affordance that we have for users to know that they can go directly to that line on the file detail page versus just going to the beginning of the file detail. Before, this link icon was only displayed when a user hovered over the line numbers area, which wasn't great for discoverability. And actually, during some of our code search research sessions, we even learned that many users were unaware that the line numbers and code results would link to that specific line in the detail page. Now, the link icon is also displayed just as the blame link when hovering over any portion of the line it is associated with, which is a much better improvement for discoverability. Also, while working on aligning to the diff pattern that we utilize for the blame link, I also became aware of a color contrast issue with the links, which we were able to quickly open an issue for and work with the create team for a quick fix. All right, and that wraps up my showcase. If you have any questions or thoughts, I'd be happy to discuss, and feel free to ping me on Slack or reach out to our global search channel for questions as well.